In 2011, a 2-year-old lay fatally injured and his 12-year-old brother faced charges that could end his life as he knew it. Beneath the crime scene tape lurked a childhood of violence, abandonment, and unanswered warnings, forcing a nation to decide whether justice means punishment, mercy, or something far more complicated. The morning of March 14, 2011 began like any other in a quiet Jacksonville, Florida neighborhood, but by midday the sound of ambulance sirens shattered the stillness. Inside a modest apartment, paramedics found 2-year-old David barely clinging to life. His tiny body bore the unmistakable signs of blunt force trauma. His skull fractured, his brain swelling. Despite frantic efforts to stabilize him, the child's injuries were catastrophic. He was rushed to the hospital, but the medical team soon realized that nothing could reverse the damage. What looked at first like a tragic household accident was about to unfold into one of the most controversial juvenile cases in modern American legal history. Authorities arriving at the scene were immediately struck by the unsettling circumstances. The only person with David during the critical hours before the 911 call was his 12-year-old half-brother, Christian Fernandez. Christian appeared calm, almost unnervingly so, offering an initial explanation that David had simply fallen while playing. The story raised doubts. The injuries were too severe to be consistent with a mere tumble. Investigators pressed gently at first, but the inconsistencies multiplied. Over hours of questioning, Christian finally admitted he had pushed David into a heavy bookcase during a moment of frustration. The toddler's head struck the wood with fatal force. It was an act of violence carried out by a child barely on the cusp of adolescence. The revelation horrified the community and confounded law enforcement. How could a boy so young inflict such deadly harm? As detectives worked to understand Christian's actions, they uncovered a family history marked by chaos, neglect, and trauma. Christian's life had begun in crisis. His mother, Bianela Susanna, was just 12 years old when she gave birth to him. His biological father disappeared almost immediately, leaving a preteen mother and an infant to navigate a world already stacked against them. From the outset, Christian lacked the stability and protection most children take for granted. Over the years, instability hardened into abuse. Bianela struggled to care for her son, while moving through relationships that exposed him to danger. One stepfather beat Christian repeatedly, leaving physical scars and emotional wounds. Reports of domestic violence reached child welfare authorities more than once, but interventions were sporadic and short-lived. Social workers noted signs of trouble, yet the system failed to secure lasting safety for the boy. Instead, he drifted from one precarious situation to another, absorbing lessons about fear, anger, and survival long before he could comprehend their meaning. By 2011, Bianela was raising Christian and 2 younger children, including David, largely on her own. On the day of the fatal incident, she left Christian in charge of his toddler brother while she ran errands, a choice that would later result in charges of child neglect. For Christian, the responsibility was overwhelming. Neighbors later described him as quiet and polite but often withdrawn, a child who seemed far older than his years. Beneath the surface, he carried the accumulated weight of abuse, abandonment, and the pressure of caring for siblings when he was still a child himself. As details emerged, the narrative grew more complicated. Christian's confession of pushing David was chilling, but his manner suggested confusion rather than malice. Experts who later evaluated him noted his limited understanding of consequences and his difficulty processing emotions. Neuroscience research supports the view that preteens lack the fully developed impulse control of adults. Christian's outburst, while deadly, appeared to stem from frustration and immaturity rather than calculated cruelty. Yet a child was dead, and the public demanded accountability. Investigators turned their attention to Bianela, whose decisions had placed Christian in a caretaker role he was unprepared to handle. They learned that after discovering David injured, she delayed calling for help, fearing involvement with authorities. Instead, she searched the internet for guidance and waited critical hours before dialing 911. Her hesitation denied David the immediate medical care that might have offered a slim chance of survival. Prosecutors later charged her with aggravated manslaughter for failing to protect her children. The tragedy reverberated far beyond the small apartment where it began. News of a 12-year-old accused of killing his toddler brother captured national attention. Television cameras lingered outside the Jacksonville courthouse as prosecutors weighed their options. Under Florida law, children as young as 12 could be charged as adults in cases of serious violent crime. State Attorney Angela Corey faced a decision that would define the case: whether to treat Christian as a misguided child in need of rehabilitation or as a murderer deserving the full force of adult punishment. Even before formal charges were announced, the debate ignited. Some residents called for mercy, citing Christian's traumatic upbringing and the obvious failures of the child welfare system. Others demanded justice for David, insisting that the severity of the injuries required a strong response regardless of Christian's age. Talk shows and opinion columns framed the case as a test of America's juvenile justice system. Was Christian a victim who snapped under unbearable pressure? Or was he a dangerous offender who posed a continuing threat? While the legal machinery turned, Christian remained in juvenile detention, a small boy in an environment designed for older teens. Guards and counselors described him as quiet, polite, and obedient, a child who spent hours reading or drawing. But the specter of a potential life sentence loomed over every interaction. If charged as an adult and convicted of first-degree murder, Christian could spend the rest of his life behind bars without the possibility of parole, a punishment more commonly associated with hardened criminals than middle school students. As investigators pieced together the timeline, the image of a single violent moment took shape. Christian's frustration had built over the course of the day as he struggled to manage David's demands. In a flash of anger, he pushed the toddler against the bookcase, an impulsive act that changed both of their lives forever. There was no evidence of premeditation, no plan to harm, only the raw, dangerous combination of youth and unchecked emotion. Yet the law did not easily account for such nuance. Outside the courtroom, advocates for juvenile justice reform seized on the case as emblematic of broader systemic failures. They argued that trying Christian as an adult would ignore decades of research showing that children's brains are still developing, particularly in areas related to judgment and self-control. Rehabilitation, they insisted, offered a far better path than permanent incarceration. Their voices grew louder as the state prepared to announce its decision, framing the case as a moral crossroads for Florida and for the nation. Inside the detention center, Christian waited. He rarely spoke of the incident, but those who interacted with him sensed a child struggling to understand the enormity of what had happened. His letters to his mother revealed a mixture of longing and confusion, expressions of love intertwined with questions he could not articulate. At 12 years old, Christian was both the accused and, in many ways, another casualty of the environment that shaped him. The first chapter of the tragedy closed with a boy behind bars, a family shattered, and a community bracing for a legal battle that would test the boundaries of justice and mercy. The decision to charge Christian Fernandez as an adult sent shockwaves through Jacksonville and far beyond. State Attorney Angela Corey announced that the boy would face first-degree murder and aggravated battery, invoking a Florida statute that allowed prosecutors to bypass juvenile court in cases of serious violent crime. It was a bold move that guaranteed a high-profile trial and carried the potential of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. To many, the prospect of such a severe penalty for a 12-year-old seemed almost unthinkable. To Corey and her team, the brutal injuries inflicted on David demanded the strongest possible response. As the legal process began, Christian's small frame and childlike demeanor contrasted sharply with the gravity of the charges. In early court appearances, he barely reached the defense table's edge, his feet dangling above the floor. Observers noted how he sat quietly, eyes downcast, while lawyers debated whether he should be treated as a child in need of rehabilitation or as an offender deserving adult punishment. Reporters filled the courtroom, their cameras capturing the image of a boy accused of an adult crime, an image that quickly became a flashpoint in the national conversation about juvenile justice. Prosecutors argued that the severity of David's injuries, massive head trauma, skull fractures, and internal bleeding, proved an act of deliberate violence rather than a tragic accident. They highlighted Christian's initial attempt to hide the truth, pointing to his shifting explanations as evidence of consciousness of guilt. The state's narrative painted a picture of a child who, despite his age, understood the harm he caused and therefore warranted adult accountability. Their strategy leaned heavily on Florida's tough-on-crime policies designed during an era when fears of super predators had led lawmakers to expand adult prosecution of juveniles. The defense countered with a portrait of a boy shaped by years of abuse and neglect. Public defenders and child advocates brought forward a mountain of evidence detailing Christian's turbulent upbringing. They described a childhood marked by violence at the hands of his stepfather, repeated exposure to domestic fights, and a mother who, herself a child when she gave birth, struggled to provide stability. Psychologists testified about the neurological development of preteens, explaining that Christian's brain was incapable of the impulse control and long-term planning that define adult reasoning. To them, his actions were the product of trauma and immaturity, not malicious intent. As these arguments unfolded, Christian remained largely silent, a presence both central and strangely absent from the drama surrounding him. Letters he wrote from detention revealed flashes of longing and confusion. He asked about his siblings, expressed love for his mother, and worried about the outcome of hearings he barely understood. Guards described him as polite and obedient, a boy who read books, drew pictures, and tried to maintain a sense of normalcy in a world that treated him as a dangerous criminal. Outside the courtroom, public opinion split sharply. Advocacy groups rallied to Christian's defense, launching petitions and social media campaigns calling for leniency. They pointed to international standards that reject life sentences for minors and demanded that Florida recognize the potential for rehabilitation. Child psychologists appeared on television to explain how trauma can warp a young mind, arguing that Christian's violent act was a symptom of systemic failure rather than innate malice. Meanwhile, supporters of the prosecution insisted that a dead toddler deserved justice and that age should not excuse lethal violence. Talk shows debated the case nightly, framing it as a clash between compassion and accountability. Bianella Susanna, Christian's mother, faced her own legal peril. She was charged with aggravated manslaughter for leaving her children unsupervised and for delaying medical help after discovering David's injuries. In her interviews with investigators, she expressed remorse but also confusion, admitting she feared the involvement of authorities who might take her children away. Her decisions on that fateful day, searching the internet for medical advice instead of calling 911, became another layer of tragedy. Prosecutors argued that her neglect set the stage for David's death, while defense attorneys painted her as an overwhelmed young woman ill-equipped to handle a crisis. As months passed, the case became a referendum on the juvenile justice system itself. Editorial boards questioned whether prosecuting a 12-year-old as an adult served any purpose beyond retribution. Legal scholars cited U.S. Supreme Court rulings that limited harsh sentences for minors, noting that science increasingly supported the idea that children possess greater capacity for change. In Florida, however, the law still granted prosecutors wide discretion, and Angela Corey showed no sign of backing down. She insisted that the facts of the case justified adult charges, emphasizing the severity of the injuries and Christian's admission that he had pushed David in anger. Inside the detention facility, Christian's daily life unfolded in quiet contrast to the legal storm outside. He attended classes, participated in counseling sessions, and met periodically with his lawyers. Staff members observed that he responded well to structure and guidance, adapting to routines that provided a sense of order absent from his early years. Some counselors privately wondered whether the boy they saw each day, a child who helped younger detainees with homework and carefully followed rules, was truly the same person described in the state's charging documents. Negotiations between prosecutors and defense attorneys stretched on, each side weighing the risks of a trial. For the state, a conviction carried the possibility of appeal and public backlash if a life sentence were imposed. For the defense, the stakes could not have been higher. A guilty verdict in adult court would condemn Christian to spend his life behind bars, effectively ending any hope of rehabilitation. Mediators floated potential plea deals, but finding a resolution that balanced punishment with the possibility of redemption proved elusive. Meanwhile, Christian's story drew international attention. Journalists from Europe and Latin America highlighted the case as an example of America's harsh juvenile sentencing practices. Human rights organizations issued statements urging Florida to reconsider. Letters of support arrived at the detention center, some from strangers who shared their own experiences of childhood trauma, others from activists advocating for reform. Each message reinforced the growing sense that this case was about more than one boy and one tragic death. It was about how a society chooses to respond when a child commits a terrible act. As the second year of legal wrangling approached, the pressure to reach a resolution intensified. Christian's defense team began to explore strategies that might avoid the risks of a full trial while preserving some hope for his future. Behind closed doors, prosecutors weighed the possibility of a plea agreement that would acknowledge the seriousness of the crime without consigning a 12-year-old to a lifetime in prison. The negotiations were tense, shaped by public scrutiny and the emotional weight of a dead child whose brief life could not be restored. Through it all, Christian remained a paradox. A child in a man's legal system, a perpetrator who was also a victim. His face, round and still faintly boyish, stared from newspaper front pages beside headlines about murder and justice. Each hearing, each motion, each televised debate underscored the collision of innocence and violence at the heart of the case. As lawyers prepared for the possibility of trial, the community waited for an answer to a question that had haunted the proceedings from the start. What does justice look like when the accused is only 12 years old? After more than 2 years of mounting tension, a fragile compromise emerged from the endless cycle of hearings and negotiations. In early 2013, prosecutors and defense attorneys reached a plea agreement that would spare Christian Fernandez the possibility of spending the rest of his life behind bars. Under the deal, Christian pleaded guilty to manslaughter in the death of his half-brother David and aggravated battery in a separate incident involving his younger sibling. In exchange, he would remain in a secure juvenile facility until his 19th birthday, followed by probation and counseling designed to guide his transition into adulthood. The agreement avoided a trial that threatened to polarize the community further and offered a path that acknowledged both accountability and the potential for rehabilitation. The announcement of the plea brought a measure of closure but little comfort. For David's short life, no sentence could restore what had been lost. Yet the deal reflected a growing understanding within the justice system that children cannot be judged by the same standards as adults. State Attorney Angela Corey defended the resolution as a responsible balance of justice and mercy, insisting that the seriousness of the crime demanded a substantial penalty while recognizing Christian's youth and the possibility of reform. Defense attorneys called the outcome a victory for common sense, praising the opportunity for Christian to receive treatment rather than an irrevocable sentence. Christian's mother, Bianala Susanna, faced her own day in court. She pleaded guilty to aggravated manslaughter for leaving her children unsupervised and delaying medical help after discovering David's injuries. Her decision to search the internet for guidance instead of calling for an ambulance became a haunting symbol of hesitation with irreversible consequences. She received a sentence of probation and mandatory parenting courses, a judgment that reflected both her culpability and her own history as a child mother overwhelmed by circumstances she could not control. The courtroom exchanges between mother and son were brief but heavy with unspoken grief, each aware of the irreversible chain of choices that had brought them there. Inside the juvenile facility, Christian began the slow process of confronting what he had done. Counselors reported that he attended therapy sessions, participated in educational programs, and maintained a record of good behavior. Teachers described a quiet, introspective student who showed aptitude for reading and drawing. Over time, he opened up to therapists about his experiences of abuse, his feelings of guilt, and the confusion that followed the fatal incident. Progress was gradual and uneven, marked by setbacks common to children dealing with complex trauma. But staff noted a growing ability to express remorse and take responsibility for his actions. Outside the detention walls, the case continued to influence public debate. Advocates for juvenile justice reform cited Christian's story as evidence of the need for rehabilitation-focused approaches for young offenders. Legal scholars referenced the case when challenging laws that allowed children to be tried as adults, arguing that Christian's plea demonstrated the importance of flexibility in sentencing. Editorials called for investment in child welfare systems to prevent similar tragedies, pointing to the repeated missed opportunities to protect Christian from the abuse and neglect that shaped his early years. The case became a touchstone in discussions about how poverty, domestic violence, and systemic failures intersect to create cycles of harm. For Christian, the years in detention were a mixture of routine and reflection. He participated in classes designed to help juveniles earn high school credits, learned coping strategies for anger and frustration, and engaged in art therapy that allowed him to process emotions he once buried. Staff members observed that he responded well to structured environments, a stark contrast to the instability of his childhood. Letters he exchanged with supporters revealed a growing awareness of the national attention his case had drawn and a cautious hope for the future. He spoke of wanting to continue his education, to use his experience as a warning to others, and to build a life that honored David's memory rather than being defined solely by his crime. As his 19th birthday approached, preparations for his release included intensive planning to ensure a stable environment. Probation terms required him to continue therapy, attend educational programs, and avoid situations that might trigger violent impulses. Social workers coordinated with family members and community organizations to provide housing and supervision. Supporters of the agreement hoped that the structure of probation would guide Christian through the critical years of early adulthood, while skeptics questioned whether society could truly rehabilitate someone who had taken a life, no matter his age. When the day of release finally arrived, Christian walked out of the juvenile facility not as the 12-year-old boy who entered but as a young man shaped by years of confinement and introspection. The world he re-entered was both familiar and foreign, filled with the ordinary freedoms of daily life but shadowed by the knowledge of what had brought him there. He carried with him the weight of a tragedy that would never fully lift, along with the fragile possibility of a future not defined entirely by violence. The aftermath of the case left lingering questions that no single verdict could answer. Could the cycle of abuse and neglect that shaped Christian's early life have been interrupted if child welfare systems had acted more decisively? Was justice served by a sentence that prioritized rehabilitation over permanent punishment? And what does it mean to hold a child accountable for an act of fatal violence when the very science of brain development shows that children lack the capacities for judgment and self-control expected of adults? For many observers, the case underscored the need for broader social change. It highlighted the importance of early intervention in families struggling with abuse, the value of mental health resources for at-risk children, and the necessity of legal frameworks that recognize the difference between youthful impulsiveness and adult malice. Christian's story became a rallying point for advocates seeking to reform juvenile sentencing laws and to create systems that focus on prevention as much as punishment. Years after his release, Christian's name still surfaces in conversations about juvenile justice, a reminder of the delicate balance between accountability and mercy. The boy who once stood accused of murder has become an enduring symbol of both the tragedy of lost childhood and the possibility of redemption. His journey reflects a hard truth. When society fails to protect its most vulnerable children, the consequences can be devastating, rippling outward to claim more than one innocent life. The death of David Fernandez remains an irreplaceable loss, a small child whose brief existence is remembered primarily through the lens of a courtroom battle. Yet his story and Christian's are inseparable, a cautionary tale about the cost of neglect and the complexity of justice. In the years since the tragedy, Florida has faced continued pressure to reconsider how it handles juvenile offenders, with Christian's case cited repeatedly as an example of why children deserve the chance to grow, to change, and to prove that a single violent act does not have to define a lifetime. In the end, the legacy of the case lies not only in the legal outcome but in the conversation it sparked. It forced a reckoning with uncomfortable truths about childhood, responsibility, and the role of society in preventing violence before it begins. Christian Fernandez entered the public eye as a frightened boy accused of an unthinkable crime. He emerged as a young man shaped by both his actions and the system's response, carrying the heavy lesson that justice is not simply about punishment but about understanding the human story behind the crime. On a quiet Easter night in suburban Nottingham, a teenage boy's hidden obsessions erupted into unthinkable violence. Behind the closed doors of a seemingly ordinary home, 14-year-old Daniel Bartlam turned chilling fantasy into reality, leaving a mother dead and a nation stunned by the darkness lurking within a child's mind. On an Easter Sunday evening in April 2011, the quiet residential streets of Red Hill, Nottingham, carried the soft hum of a holiday night. Families settled into their homes after a long weekend, children prepared for the return to school, and neighbors exchanged polite greetings as the sun faded into a cool spring dusk. Among those homes stood the modest semi-detached house of Jacqueline "Jackie" Bartlam, a hardworking mother who had built a stable life for her two sons after the end of her marriage. The home was neat, warm, and filled with the small comforts of family life. A place that should have been a refuge from harm. Behind its front door, however, the calm masked a brewing darkness that no one in the neighborhood could have imagined. Jackie Bartlam was known to those around her as gentle and resilient. Friends described her as a woman devoted to her children, always putting their needs ahead of her own. Since separating from her husband, she had balanced work and parenting with quiet determination, creating a routine that gave her sons a sense of security. She doted on her youngest boy, who was still in primary school, and tried patiently to navigate the more turbulent moods of her teenage son Daniel. At 14, Daniel was in the confusing territory between boyhood and adulthood. He was tall for his age, with a mop of fair hair and an expression that alternated between shy reserve and flashes of adolescent defiance. Teachers at his school considered him polite, if somewhat withdrawn. Neighbors remembered a boy who rarely caused trouble and seemed content to keep to himself. To the outside world, there was nothing to suggest the darkness that would soon surface. But inside Daniel's mind, a far more sinister narrative was unfolding. From an early age, he had developed a fascination with television dramas and films that explored crime, murder, and psychological manipulation. He spent hours watching soap operas such as Coronation Street, particularly episodes featuring violent storylines, and absorbed crime documentaries that detailed real-life killings. His interest was not a passing phase of youthful curiosity. It deepened into an obsession. Alone in his room, he began to write fictional accounts of murders, constructing scenes of revenge and horror with a level of detail that startled those who would later read them. His stories often centered on a teenage boy committing a brutal killing and escaping without consequence. These writings remained hidden, unknown to teachers and family members who saw only the quiet, studious teenager he presented to the world. Life inside the Bartlam household carried the everyday rhythms of a single-parent family. Jackie managed the demands of work and parenting with steady commitment. There were occasional tensions between mother and son, typical disagreements about chores, schoolwork, and Daniel's growing desire for independence. Friends recalled that Jackie sometimes confided in them about Daniel's moodiness, noting that he could be sullen and withdrawn. Yet she never expressed fear of him. She believed, as many parents would, that his behavior reflected the turbulence of adolescence rather than something more dangerous. Daniel, however, harbored resentments he rarely voiced. He felt overshadowed by the attention his younger brother received and resented the limits his mother set. Beneath his polite exterior, he nurtured a quiet anger and an emerging fantasy of striking back. In the weeks leading up to Easter Sunday, Daniel's private writings took on a more ominous tone. He began drafting a story about a teenage boy who murders his mother with a hammer and then sets fire to the house to destroy evidence. The plot was disturbingly precise, mirroring the very act he would later commit. He stored these files on his computer, revisiting them in the late hours when the house was silent. The line between fiction and reality began to blur. While Jackie went about her daily routine, unaware of the danger, Daniel was rehearsing a deadly plan that would turn their home into a crime scene. That evening, the house appeared peaceful to anyone passing by. Inside, Jackie prepared for a quiet night. She had worked hard through the holiday and looked forward to a restful end to the long weekend. Her younger son was with his father, leaving only Daniel at home with her. There were no loud arguments or signs of an impending confrontation. Jackie retired to her bedroom, unaware that her eldest child had already hidden a hammer in his room, waiting for the moment he had envisioned countless times. As the house grew still and Jackie drifted toward sleep, Daniel's thoughts hardened into action. He retrieved the hammer and moved silently toward his mother's room. The decision was deliberate, the movements precise, as though he were stepping into a scene he had already played out in his mind. What followed was an act of shocking brutality. Daniel struck his mother repeatedly with the hammer, delivering at least 7 powerful blows to her head. The attack was frenzied but controlled, a calculated execution by a child whose fantasies had finally erupted into reality. Jackie had no chance to defend herself. The woman who had nurtured and protected him lay fatally wounded in the very room meant to provide her rest. The violence did not end with the killing. Almost immediately, Daniel turned to the next stage of his plan. He gathered flammable materials and set fires in the house, carefully arranging the scene to mimic a tragic accident. His intention was to erase evidence, to transform a deliberate murder into a deadly blaze. Flames began to spread through the home, consuming the familiar comforts of family life. With the fire growing, Daniel took the family dog and stepped outside into the cold night. He dialed emergency services, his voice carrying the tremor of a frightened survivor. He claimed he had narrowly escaped a sudden fire that had trapped his mother inside. To the dispatcher, he sounded shaken but coherent, a teenage boy desperate for help. When firefighters arrived, thick smoke poured from the windows and the smell of burning wood filled the air. They entered the house and fought their way through the flames, eventually discovering Jackie's body in the bedroom. The fire had caused significant damage, but trained eyes quickly noticed irregularities. Patterns in the burns suggested accelerant use, and certain areas of the home appeared deliberately set alight. What first seemed like a tragic domestic fire began to look more like a carefully staged crime. Outside, Daniel stood with the family dog, watching the scene unfold. He told police and firefighters a story of being awakened by smoke, of seeing his mother trapped by flames, of a mysterious masked intruder who might have set the fire. His face was pale but his demeanor unervingly calm. The boy who claimed to have witnessed his mother's death showed none of the panic or grief that rescuers expected. As the night wore on and the fire crews secured the house, investigators began to question the narrative Daniel presented. His account of a masked stranger was vague and inconsistent. The timeline of his escape shifted in small but significant ways each time he repeated it. Detectives noticed his lack of visible distress, the absence of tears or shock. While the house still smoldered behind them, a different kind of heat began to build, a quiet suspicion that the survivor standing before them might not be the victim he claimed to be. As dawn broke over Red Hill, the charred shell of the Bartlam home stood as a silent witness to the night's tragedy. Fire crews had finally subdued the flames, leaving behind a blackened structure filled with the acrid scent of smoke and damp ash. Inside, crime scene investigators began the painstaking process of examining every corner for clues that might explain the death of Jacqueline Bartlam. Though the fire had damaged much of the property, experienced forensic officers quickly identified troubling signs. Burn patterns on the floors and walls suggested multiple points of ignition. Items that should have burned thoroughly were only partially charred, indicating the fire had been started deliberately and fueled by accelerants. What initially appeared to be an unfortunate domestic accident now bore the hallmarks of arson. Detectives focused on the only known witness, 14-year-old Daniel Bartlam. He had spent the night in police care, presenting himself as a frightened but composed teenager. His first statements to investigators told a dramatic story. He claimed that while he was in his room late at night, he heard noises downstairs. Venturing to investigate, he allegedly encountered a masked intruder who attacked his mother. According to Daniel, the stranger fled after starting the fire, leaving him to escape with the family dog through thick smoke and spreading flames. He described the assailant as a man in dark clothing, face hidden by a balaclava, and insisted he had barely managed to survive the ordeal. On the surface, Daniel's account might have explained the chaos inside the house. Yet as detectives compared his words with the evidence emerging from the scene, discrepancies began to surface. Forensic experts determined that the fire had been ignited in multiple rooms using household materials, an action requiring preparation and calm rather than the frantic movements of a fleeing intruder. Jackie's body showed no defensive injuries beyond the catastrophic head trauma, suggesting she had been attacked while asleep. The wounds were consistent with repeated blows from a blunt object. A methodical search of the property soon uncovered the likely weapon, a blood-stained hammer hidden among the debris. Detectives returned to Daniel for further questioning. They pressed for details about the intruder's appearance, movements, and method of entry. His answers grew vague and inconsistent. At times he added small embellishments, describing noises or shadows he claimed to have seen. Other times he contradicted earlier statements about when he noticed the fire or how he escaped. His calm demeanor, which might have been attributed to shock in the immediate aftermath, began to unsettle the investigators. There were no tears, No visible signs of grief for a boy who had just lost his mother. Instead, he maintained an almost detached composure, as if reciting a script. The investigation broadened to include Daniel's school life, friendships, and digital footprint. Detectives interviewed teachers and classmates, most of whom described him as quiet, polite, and somewhat introverted. He participated in drama classes and showed an interest in film and television, particularly crime-related content. None of them reported any obvious warning signs of violent tendencies. However, when officers examined Daniel's bedroom, they discovered notebooks filled with dark, violent stories. In one, a teenage boy murdered his mother with a hammer and set fire to the house to cover his tracks. The parallels to the crime scene were striking. Attention quickly turned to Daniel's computer. Digital forensic specialists retrieved files and internet history that deepened the growing suspicion. Among the recovered materials were drafts of short stories describing gruesome killings, along with bookmarked videos and articles about real-life murders. Investigators also found that he had recently searched for methods of starting fires and destroying evidence. Most chilling was a document outlining a murder plot nearly identical to the events in Red Hill. A son striking his mother with a hammer and igniting the home to mask the crime. The discovery of this material left detectives with little doubt that the fire and the killing were not the work of an intruder but the calculated actions of the boy sitting in their interview room. Faced with the mounting evidence, detectives adopted a careful strategy. They conducted a series of interviews, each designed to chip away at Daniel's story. Initially, he clung to the narrative of a masked attacker, repeating the details with rehearsed precision. When confronted with the inconsistencies and the discovery of the hammer, his responses became hesitant. Detectives revealed the contents of his computer files, pointing out the eerie similarities between his fictional writing and the murder of his mother. Daniel listened, his expression revealing little. After long silences and cautious denials, he finally offered a partial admission. He acknowledged striking his mother but claimed it was not premeditated. He insisted the attack had been a sudden explosion of anger, triggered by an argument he could barely recall. Investigators, however, were unconvinced. The deliberate placement of fires, the hidden weapon, and the pre-written stories all indicated planning. A spontaneous outburst could not explain the level of preparation or the careful steps taken to create the illusion of an accidental blaze. Prosecutors began to assemble a case portraying Daniel as a calculating killer who transformed violent fantasies into reality. They argued that his fascination with television murder plots, particularly a Coronation Street storyline involving a hammer attack, had provided both inspiration and method. As the legal process unfolded, the community of Red Hill struggled to reconcile the polite teenager they thought they knew with the grim details emerging from the investigation. Neighbors recalled seeing Daniel play outside with friends, walking the family dog, or exchanging shy greetings. Teachers remembered a student who participated in class and showed no overt signs of danger. The contrast between the boy's outward normalcy and the horrific crime challenged their understanding of how violence can hide behind a mask of innocence. Parents in the area found themselves looking at their own children differently, grappling with the unsettling question of whether such darkness could ever be predicted. Meanwhile, Jackie's friends and relatives faced a devastating reality. They had lost a loving mother, daughter, and friend in a manner almost too cruel to comprehend. During interviews with police, family members described Jackie as patient and kind, a woman who worked tirelessly to provide for her sons. They expressed disbelief that the quiet boy she had raised could be responsible for her death. The tragedy deepened when they learned that Jackie's younger son, away with his father that night, would now grow up carrying the knowledge that his own brother had taken their mother's life. The prosecution prepared to present a narrative of deliberate murder fueled by obsession. They highlighted the careful planning evident in the hidden hammer and multiple ignition points. They emphasized the chilling foresight in Daniel's writings, portraying them as blueprints for the crime rather than mere fiction. The defense faced the challenge of representing a defendant who was barely 14 at the time of the killing. They argued that Daniel was a troubled adolescent, overwhelmed by emotions he could not control, and that the act, while horrific, was not the calculated execution the prosecution described. Questions of intent, maturity, and psychological state would become central to the trial that followed. As court proceedings drew near, public fascination with the case intensified. Media outlets across the United Kingdom reported on each new revelation, focusing on the stark contrast between Daniel's age and the savagery of his actions. Headlines described him as a baby-faced killer, capturing the nation's uneasy fascination with a child capable of such brutality. Behind the sensational coverage, investigators continued to refine their timeline, seeking to ensure that every piece of evidence would withstand the scrutiny of the courtroom. The hammer, the fire patterns, the computer files, and the inconsistencies in Daniel's statements formed a chilling mosaic. Together they painted a picture of a boy who had carefully plotted a murder and attempted to script his own escape, only to be undone by the very details he believed would protect him. When the trial opened at Nottingham Crown Court in early 2012, the public gallery filled with journalists, local residents, and family members seeking answers to a crime that seemed to defy understanding. Daniel Bartlam, just 15 by the time of the proceedings, appeared in the dock wearing a suit that accentuated his youth rather than maturity. His pale face and quiet demeanor contrasted sharply with the brutal acts he was accused of committing. Because of his age, the court took precautions to shield him from unnecessary exposure, but the gravity of the charges ensured that every word was closely reported. The prosecution presented a case built on a meticulous reconstruction of the night of April 25, 2011. They described how Daniel had armed himself with a hammer, waited for his mother to sleep, and struck her repeatedly with a calculated ferocity. Forensic experts detailed the blood spatter patterns that indicated a sustained attack and confirmed that Jackie Bartlam would have died within moments. Fire investigators testified about the multiple points of ignition throughout the house, explaining how the blaze was deliberately set to mimic an accidental fire and destroy physical evidence. Each witness reinforced the prosecution's assertion that this was not a sudden act of rage but a carefully premeditated killing. Key to the prosecution's argument were the writings retrieved from Daniel's computer. Detectives read excerpts from stories describing a teenage boy murdering his mother with a hammer and burning the house. The language was disturbingly close to the actual events, down to the method of escape and the use of a phone call to create a false alibi. Prosecutor Adrian Clifton told the jury that these documents were not harmless fiction but blueprints for murder. He highlighted Daniel's fascination with a Coronation Street storyline in which a character kills with a hammer, drawing a direct line between the television plot and the crime. The defense countered with a portrayal of a troubled adolescent overwhelmed by emotional turmoil. They argued that Daniel was suffering from psychological stress following his parents' divorce, and that the killing was the result of a sudden, uncontrollable outburst rather than a calculated plan. Expert witnesses discussed the developmental immaturity of a 14-year-old brain, emphasizing impulsivity and the difficulty of understanding long-term consequences. Defense counsel suggested that the violent writings were a form of fantasy or therapy rather than a literal plan, evidence of a boy lost in fiction rather than intent on murder. Throughout the trial, Daniel sat mostly motionless, listening as intimate details of his life and mind were laid bare. When he did speak, he maintained that he had no clear memory of the attack. He admitted striking his mother but insisted he had not planned to kill her, claiming he was angry after an argument and that the fire was a panicked attempt to cover up what he called a terrible mistake. His soft voice and boyish appearance clashed with the brutal facts of the case, creating a dissonance that unsettled jurors and observers alike. Witness after witness painted a picture of Jackie Bartlam as a loving mother devoted to her children. Friends and colleagues described her kindness, patience, and tireless effort to provide a stable home. Her absence hung over the courtroom, a silent reminder of the life cut short and the family forever altered. When photographs of Jackie were shown to the jury, some members of the public gallery wept. The contrast between the smiling woman in the images and the horrific details of her death underscored the enormity of the crime. After weeks of testimony, the jury retired to deliberate. The evidence of premeditation, the hidden hammer, the ignition points, the digital writings, proved impossible to ignore. They rejected the defense's claim of a spontaneous outburst and returned a unanimous verdict of guilty for murder. Because Daniel was a minor, the judge faced the complex task of balancing punishment with the possibility of rehabilitation. During sentencing, Mr. Justice Alistair Macduff addressed Daniel directly. He described the killing as a brutal and callous attack, carried out with chilling deliberation. He noted the planning involved, the effort to create a false narrative, and the lack of remorse shown in the aftermath. At the same time, the judge acknowledged Daniel's youth, recognizing that the law required a different approach than would be applied to an adult. He imposed a life sentence with a minimum term of 16 years before eligibility for parole, meaning Daniel would remain in custody well into adulthood. The verdict and sentence sent ripples through the United Kingdom. Media outlets debated the implications of a child committing such a calculated act. Commentators questioned whether violent television and internet content had influenced Daniel's mind or merely provided a script for impulses that already existed. Psychologists discussed the challenges of identifying dangerous behavior in adolescence, noting that many of the warning signs, withdrawal, fascination with dark media, private writing, are common among teenagers who never commit violence. The case became a touchstone in conversations about youth crime, mental health, and the limits of parental awareness. For Jackie's family, the legal outcome offered little comfort. They faced the dual tragedy of losing a beloved daughter and mother, while knowing that her killer was also part of their family. Jackie's younger son, spared by chance on the night of the murder, would grow up with the knowledge that his brother had taken their mother's life. Relatives spoke publicly about the emotional devastation, describing sleepless nights and unanswered questions about why Daniel acted as he did. Their grief was compounded by the impossibility of completely severing ties with the boy who caused it, a child they had once loved and nurtured. Inside the youth detention facility where he began his sentence, Daniel entered a world far removed from the suburban streets of Nottingham. Reports from those early years described a quiet inmate who followed rules and participated in educational programs. Psychologists assessed him regularly, attempting to determine whether he felt remorse or merely regret at being caught. Some staff believed he showed signs of introspection. Others remained cautious, noting the difficulty of gauging genuine empathy in a teenager capable of such violence. The question of whether he could ever be safely reintegrated into society remained unresolved. As time passed, the Bartlam case continued to haunt the public imagination. Documentaries and crime programs revisited the story, exploring how a boy who appeared ordinary could harbor such lethal intent. Scholars analyzed the role of fantasy and media influence, while legal experts debated the adequacy of sentencing guidelines for juvenile offenders. Each retelling returned to the same unsettling reality. Behind the polite smile of a teenage boy had lurked a capacity for calculated brutality. Years after the trial, the house in Red Hill was repaired and sold, its walls bearing silent witness to the night of violence and fire. Neighbors moved on, but the memory lingered in quiet conversations and cautious glances. For those who had known Jackie and Daniel, the tragedy remained a stark reminder that evil can emerge where it is least expected. The case stood as a testament to the fragility of ordinary life, where the familiar warmth of a family home can conceal the cold machinery of a deadly plan. Daniel Bartlam will spend the better part of his youth and early adulthood behind bars, carrying the label of a child killer. Whether he will one day walk free remains a matter for parole boards and psychological evaluations. Yet no matter the outcome, the events of that Easter Sunday will forever define him. The boy who once blended quietly into the background of suburban Nottingham now occupies a place in the annals of British crime. A reminder that darkness can take root in the most unlikely of hearts, and that sometimes the greatest danger lies not outside the home, but within it. A gifted child with a genius mind, a loving mother rebuilding her life, and a 4-year-old girl who trusted her big brother, until one winter night shattered everything. This is the chilling true story of Paris Bennett, whose calculated betrayal turned a quiet Texas home into a scene of unthinkable tragedy. On a cold February night in 2007, the quiet town of Abilene, Texas, seemed wrapped in the kind of stillness that comes when winter tightens its grip. Families settled into their homes, the streets emptied, and the wind carried only the faint sound of distant traffic. Inside a modest house on a suburban street, 13-year-old Paris Bennett sat with his 4-year-old sister Ella while their mother, Charity Lee, stepped out briefly to meet a friend. It was a familiar arrangement. Charity trusted her gifted son, a boy celebrated for his intelligence and quick wit, to care for the little girl until she returned. To outsiders, their household looked like an ordinary single-parent family striving to build a peaceful life. But beneath the surface of calm routine, something far more sinister had been quietly gathering. Paris was no ordinary teenager. His IQ measured at 141, placing him firmly in the category of genius. Teachers praised his analytical mind and effortless grasp of complex ideas. He read voraciously, solved puzzles with ease, and often charmed adults with his articulate conversation. Yet there were subtler signs that brilliance did not equate to balance. Friends recalled his tendency to withdraw suddenly, to observe rather than participate, as though he were cataloging human behavior rather than sharing in it. Charity, proud of his talents, sometimes sensed a distance in her son that she struggled to bridge. Still, she believed their bond was strong, forged in the aftermath of her own turbulent past. Years earlier, Charity had battled drug addiction, a fight that cost her relationships and stability before she rebuilt her life for her children. By 2007, she was sober, working hard to provide a stable home. Paris had witnessed those struggles and the fragile recovery that followed. Some who later studied the case suggested that the family's history left deep impressions on the boy. The fear of losing his mother, the memory of instability, and an unspoken resentment toward the attention given to Ella may have combined into a dangerous emotional current. On the surface, however, there were no open signs of danger. Paris played the role of the responsible older brother, reading bedtime stories and helping with chores, while Ella adored him with the unquestioning love of a small child. That evening unfolded with deceptive normality. Charity kissed her children goodnight, leaving them with instructions and the comforting assurance that she would return soon. Paris appeared calm, a young man capable of handling the simple task of watching his sister. Once the front door closed, the atmosphere inside the house shifted in ways only Paris could fully understand. Alone with Ella, he accessed adult content on the family computer, a deliberate act that investigators later interpreted as a way to stay awake and focused. The blue glow of the screen illuminated his face as he sat in silence, plotting an act that would forever sever the life of the family. Hours passed quietly until Paris made his move. He coaxed Ella into the bedroom, presenting it as a game, the kind of innocent suggestion an older brother might make on a late night. Trusting him completely, she followed without hesitation. What happened next was both sudden and chilling in its calculation. Paris retrieved a kitchen knife and attacked his sister with a violence that stunned even seasoned detectives. 17 times the blade pierced her small body, each strike a deliberate choice rather than a moment of uncontrollable rage. Neighbors heard nothing. The only sounds were the muffled cries of a child and the steady breath of the boy who ended her life. When the assault was over, Paris displayed a composure that would later haunt emergency operators and investigators alike. He dialed 911 with the steady voice of someone reporting a routine incident rather than a brutal homicide. On the recorded call, he calmly described the situation, requesting medical assistance and offering precise details of Ella's condition. The operator, alarmed by the flatness of his tone, tried to guide him through basic first aid, but there was no urgency in his responses. By the time paramedics arrived, the scene was one of quiet devastation. Ella lay bleeding and barely alive, her small form a stark contrast to the teenage boy standing nearby with a phone still in his hand. Despite frantic efforts to save her, she succumbed to her wounds shortly after reaching the hospital. When Charity returned home, she was met not by the warmth of her children, but by flashing lights and the cold efficiency of law enforcement. The image of her house surrounded by emergency vehicles, the realization that her daughter was gone, and the knowledge that her son was responsible shattered her world in an instant. At first, disbelief shielded her from the full horror. How could the boy she had nurtured commit such an act? Investigators faced the same question as they examined the crime scene. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle with an intruder. The story Paris offered to police was brief and controlled, lacking the confusion or panic expected from a child who had just witnessed violence. As detectives dug deeper, the contours of a disturbing plan emerged. Computer records showed that Paris had deliberately accessed explicit material before the murder, ensuring he remained awake and alert. There were no indications of a sudden quarrel or provocation. Every action pointed to intent. Psychologists called to evaluate him were struck by the combination of youthful intelligence and cold precision. This was not an impulsive tragedy born of adolescent anger but a carefully orchestrated act. Later analysis suggested that Paris's true target was not Ella herself but his mother. By killing the sister Charity adored, he aimed to inflict an emotional wound that would never heal, binding mother and son together in a lifelong web of grief and guilt. As the night wore on and the evidence mounted, Paris was taken into custody. Officers described him as eerily calm, answering questions with polite detachment. There were no tears, no frantic denials, only a quiet acknowledgement of the facts. In the sterile confines of the police station, the brilliance that once earned him praise now cast a shadow. Investigators struggled to reconcile the image of a gifted child with the reality of a calculated killer. Outside, the town of Abilene stirred to the news of a crime almost too terrible to comprehend. A mother had lost her daughter and, in a different way, her son, in a single night that began like any other and ended in an act of unimaginable betrayal. In the days following the murder, Abilene awoke to a storm of disbelief and sorrow. News of the crime spread quickly, carrying with it the unsettling revelation that the killer was not a stranger but the victim's own 13-year-old brother. Neighbors who had known the family struggled to reconcile the quiet, intelligent boy they remembered with the horrific details emerging from police reports. Candlelight vigils formed outside the Lee home as the community searched for meaning in a tragedy that seemed beyond understanding. Inside the walls of the county juvenile facility, Paris Bennett remained composed, his demeanor confounding detectives and psychologists alike. While most children might collapse under the weight of guilt or fear, Paris maintained a calm that bordered on unnerving. He answered questions with the clarity of a seasoned adult, describing events with a precision that left even veteran investigators unsettled. Interviews revealed that the killing had been carefully premeditated. Forensic analysis of the family computer showed that Paris had deliberately viewed explicit material before the attack, a calculated tactic to ensure he stayed awake and alert. There were no signs of provocation or sudden anger. He had waited patiently for his mother to leave, lured Ella into the bedroom under the guise of a game, and carried out the stabbing with deliberate focus. When asked about motive, Paris offered explanations that shifted subtly depending on the listener. At times he claimed it was a sudden act of rage, at others that he was protecting his mother from potential relapse, fearing that Child Protective Services might re-enter their lives if he reported a fabricated problem. Investigators suspected these were smokescreens masking a far darker truth. The murder was an act of calculated revenge aimed at the one person he loved and resented in equal measure, his mother. Charity Lee faced the crushing reality of preparing for her daughter's funeral while attending hearings for her son's detention. Friends and relatives rallied around her, but the emotional terrain was impossible to navigate. She had lost Ella in the most violent way imaginable and now confronted the fact that the child she once rocked to sleep was accused of murder. When she first saw Paris in custody, he greeted her with the same polite warmth he had always shown, as though nothing had changed. That small, chilling smile became a memory she would never forget. Despite her grief, Charity resolved to remain present in her son's life, a decision that drew both admiration and confusion from those around her. She visited him regularly, speaking through the thick glass of the detention center, searching for a flicker of remorse that might signal hope. Psychological evaluations added further complexity to the case. Specialists were divided in their assessments. Some described Paris as exhibiting traits consistent with psychopathy: shallow affect, manipulative charm, and a lack of empathy. Others saw a deeply intelligent but emotionally fractured boy, shaped by childhood instability and a desperate need for control. He demonstrated a keen understanding of human behavior, often engaging psychologists in philosophical debates about morality and free will. His ability to mimic empathy, offering carefully chosen words of regret without the emotional resonance to match, left professionals uncertain whether they were observing a sociopath or a gifted child struggling with emotions too complex for his age. The legal process moved swiftly. Because of his age, Paris could not face the death penalty, but the brutality and planning behind the crime compelled prosecutors to try him as an adult. Court hearings revealed chilling details of the night. Emergency dispatchers testified to the unnerving calm of his 911 call, replaying the audio in a courtroom heavy with silence. Paramedics described the scene inside the home: a small girl bleeding on the floor, a teenage boy standing nearby with an expression they could not easily name. For Charity, each testimony reopened wounds still raw from the night of the murder. She sat in the gallery listening to the clinical recounting of her daughter's final moments, while her surviving child faced the consequences of his actions. Paris's defense attorneys focused on his youth and the possibility of rehabilitation, arguing that his extraordinary intelligence and lack of prior violent behavior warranted a sentence that allowed for eventual reintegration into society. Prosecutors countered with the calculated nature of the killing, emphasizing the 17 knife wounds and the deliberate steps he took to ensure his mother's absence. The courtroom became a battleground not only over legal responsibility but over the broader question of whether a child capable of such cruelty could ever truly change. Reporters filled the seats, their coverage turning the case into a national conversation about juvenile crime, mental health, and the limits of forgiveness. Throughout the proceedings, Paris maintained the same composure he had displayed since the night of the murder. He listened attentively, occasionally taking notes, his face betraying little of the emotions expected from someone so young facing decades behind bars. Observers noted moments when he appeared almost proud of his ability to remain calm, as though detachment itself were a measure of strength. When given the opportunity to speak, he expressed regret in carefully constructed sentences that sounded rehearsed. Whether these words reflected genuine remorse or an intellectual understanding of what remorse should sound like remained a subject of debate. In 2007, the court delivered its verdict. Paris Bennett was sentenced to 40 years in prison, the maximum penalty available under Texas law for a juvenile tried as an adult. The sentence offered no possibility of parole until he served at least half of the term, meaning he would spend a minimum of 20 years behind bars before the possibility of release. For the community, the decision brought a measure of legal resolution but little emotional closure. The idea of a brilliant child methodically murdering his sister defied the usual narratives of either accidental tragedy or sudden rage. It was a crime that forced neighbors, jurors, and experts to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil and the limits of understanding. In the months after the sentencing, Charity Lee struggled to rebuild a life defined by loss. She faced not only the absence of her daughter but the ongoing reality of her son's incarceration. Friends encouraged her to cut ties, to protect herself from further pain, but she refused. Instead, she began visiting Paris in prison, determined to maintain a relationship even as she mourned Ella. Each visit was a collision of love and horror, a meeting between a mother and the boy who had forever changed the shape of her world. In those encounters, Charity searched for meaning, for a way to hold on to the child she loved without excusing the act that had taken her daughter's life. Her decision to forgive, though not to forget, would become a central theme in the years that followed, shaping not only her personal journey, but the way the world came to understand one of the most haunting crimes in Texas history. Years passed inside the Texas prison system, but the shadow of that February night never loosened its grip on anyone connected to the case. Paris Bennett entered adulthood behind bars, his genius mind adapting to the rigid structure of incarceration. Guards and counselors observed a young man who read voraciously, debated philosophy, and maintained a startling composure. He enrolled in educational programs, earned high marks, and wrote essays that revealed a fascination with ethics and human behavior. Those who spoke with him were struck by his ability to articulate complex ideas about morality and personal responsibility. Yet beneath the polished surface, an unsettling ambiguity remained. His words conveyed understanding of right and wrong, but the emotional resonance of true remorse often seemed absent, leaving professionals unsure whether they were speaking with a rehabilitated young man or a masterful performer. Charity Lee continued her journey through a landscape of grief that few could imagine. She buried Ella with a mother's trembling hands, then began the slow work of living with a loss compounded by betrayal. In the beginning, anger threatened to consume her, but she chose a different path. Instead of turning away from her son, she visited him regularly, sitting across from the boy who had taken her daughter and listening to the measured cadence of his thoughts. Their conversations were filled with ordinary details. Books read, classes completed, fragments of daily life that hinted at normalcy. Yet each exchange carried the weight of the irreversible. Charity described moments of connection, times when Paris's quick humor or keen insights reminded her of the child she once knew. But there were also moments when his steady gaze and controlled speech sent a chill through her, a reminder of the night he methodically ended his sister's life. Outside the prison, Charity transformed her pain into action. She founded the Ella Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting victims of violence, offenders, and their families. Through public speaking and outreach, she shared her story with audiences who struggled to comprehend the depth of her forgiveness. She spoke of love as an unbreakable bond, insisting that hatred would only deepen the wound left by violence. Her advocacy drew both admiration and skepticism. Some praised her courage to embrace compassion. Others questioned whether forgiveness in such a case was possible or even appropriate. Charity never claimed it was easy. She described forgiveness as an ongoing process rather than a single act, a decision made each day to resist the corrosive power of vengeance. Meanwhile, Paris became the subject of continued media fascination. Documentaries and interviews offered glimpses into his life behind bars. In one widely viewed film, he spoke calmly about the murder, recounting details with the precision of a storyteller rather than the anguish of a perpetrator. Viewers debated his sincerity. Some believed his intelligence allowed him to analyze his crime without the expected displays of emotion. Others suspected manipulation, pointing to his ability to charm interviewers and control the narrative. Psychologists who watched these appearances remained divided. Was he a sociopath whose genius sharpened his capacity for deception, or a damaged soul seeking meaning in the aftermath of an unforgivable act? The legal implications of his sentence ensured that the case remained active in public memory. Under Texas law, Paris would become eligible for parole after serving 20 years of his 40-year sentence. That possibility loomed over Charity and the community as the years advanced. Supporters of rehabilitation argued that a crime committed at 13 should not define an entire lifetime, especially for someone demonstrating intelligence and potential for growth. Others warned that the calculated nature of the murder revealed a danger that no amount of education or good behavior could erase. Charity herself wrestled with the question. She expressed hope that her son might one day build a life beyond prison walls. Yet she admitted to fearing what freedom might mean for those who crossed his path. Her public statements captured the painful duality of a mother's heart, a desire for her child's redemption and an awareness of the darkness he carried. Inside prison, Paris continued to cultivate the image of a scholar. He engaged in debates about ethics, corresponded with researchers studying juvenile offenders, and explored subjects ranging from neuroscience to classical literature. Letters to journalists revealed a young man fascinated by the nature of evil and the limits of free will. He once wrote that understanding his crime required acknowledging the potential for violence within every human being, a statement that unsettled those seeking simple explanations. His reflections, while intellectually compelling, offered no comfort to those mourning Ella. The absence of spontaneous emotion, the careful construction of every thought, left lingering doubts about whether insight could substitute for empathy. For Charity, the years brought moments of fragile peace, but no true closure. Birthdays and anniversaries arrived with a bittersweet ache. Photographs of Ella remained throughout her home, reminders of the bright-eyed child whose life was stolen. Yet she continued to advocate for compassion, believing that society must address the roots of violence rather than merely punish its outcomes. Through the Ella Foundation, she worked with both victims and offenders, seeking to break the cycles that had destroyed her own family. Her talks often ended with a message that startled listeners. Forgiveness does not excuse the crime, but it frees the heart from being chained to hatred. As Paris's parole eligibility draws nearer, the story continues to provoke debate. Legal experts weigh the risks of release against the ideals of rehabilitation. True crime followers revisit the case, dissecting every interview for signs of remorse or danger. The home where the murder occurred still stands in Abilene, a silent monument to the night when brilliance and brutality collided in a 13-year-old mind. Neighbors have long since moved on, but the memory lingers like a scar across the quiet neighborhood streets. The tragedy of Paris Bennett defies easy categorization. It is a story of genius twisted by hidden motives, of a mother who chose love over hatred, of a community forced to question the limits of justice. Whether Paris is ultimately released or remains behind bars, the legacy of that February night endures as a haunting reminder that evil can wear the face of a child and that forgiveness, though extraordinary, does not erase the wound. For Charity, life remains a balance between loss and love, between the memory of a daughter who will never grow older and the son whose future remains uncertain. Each prison visit, each quiet conversation across the visiting room table, becomes another chapter in a story that will never truly end, a testament to the enduring complexity of the human heart and the unfathomable depths of both violence and grace.